So welcome to the Talking Teaching podcast. I'm here today with Arthur, and if you can introduce yourself for us before we get started, that'd be great.
Sure. I'm Arthur Chiaravalli. My job here is in Vermont is house director at CVU, Champlain Valley Union High School. And I'm also the founder of Teachers Going Gradeless, which is a group of teachers who are convinced that teaching and learning can be better when we grade less.
Yeah, really interesting. So it's great to meet you, Arthur. And I think this is going to be a new topic for the podcast, although it's something that I've talked about elsewhere. But when I have, it's been based on some wishes and personal ideologies. So it'll be really good to speak with you about about going gradeless and how you've done that in perhaps a more concrete or at least a more formalized, structured way, perhaps.
Sure.
So how long have you been working in and around the gradeless movement, and what first piqued your interest?
Well, I do think that a lot of us came from probably, standards-based learning and grading. I think a lot of us got started in that. I heard Ken O'Connor, who is probably one of the foremost people in that field back in 2005.
Okay.
And he just revolutionized my thinking about grading. At the time, I hadn't really given it much thought. But talking about some of those more toxic grading practices, like zeros or late penalties and, behavior related things too, sort of employability skills getting mixed into the academic grade, all those kinds of things never occurred to me that there was a problem with that.
Right.
I really adopted most of those sort of more humane practices that the standards-based learning and grading community recommended. So, multiple opportunities to demonstrate learning, no late penalties, no zeros. If there was an issue with plagiarism or cheating or anything like that, that would be dealt with somewhere else. That wouldn't be
Yeah.
dealt with in the academic grade. So
Yeah. Good.
to me, that's the beginning of going gradeless. I really do think that that was a very important part in my formation. I'm very glad that it happened early in my career.
Hmm.
At the time I was teaching alternative education, we had students, primarily we catered to students who had children. So high
Okay.
school students who were teen parents.
Sure.
I had a very visionary superintendent who himself was a teen parent
Okay.
and wanted to have this school where these kids generally have some pretty bad outcomes,
Yeah.
were able to come to us and finish up. And really, it helped us, I think, looking at it in these terms when it came to questions about credit recovery in particular. It just doesn't make sense to throw someone into geometry because that's where they should be, at this age.
Yeah.
So we were able to look at that, I think, in various classes and to really support them in what they needed. So that was pretty formative to me. I think as time went on, I began to hear more and more about people who were just getting rid of the grade altogether. And I think a lot of the main research that we point to is this idea, and it's been expressed by a lot of different people, and there's been a lot of research on this. But the gist of it is feedback. When you pair comments, which are great, with grades, you would think that that's the richest form of feedback. You get some numbers, you get some descriptions, and you know where you stand. But I think anyone who's been in schools knows that kids just look at the number or the
Yep.
score, and then they put it in their backpack or they recycle it or they throw it away.
Right.
And that's been shown time and time again. So as a teacher who spent hours of time providing what I thought were meaningful comments, that was a shocking realization. And I wanted my students to really benefit from this dialogue that we might be able to enter into in my particular case, in writing. I've taught in a couple other subject areas. I've taught math, but I don't think that it was fully to this point when I was teaching math. But certainly with language arts, English teaching, there's just a lot of feedback. And when you have this realization that people may not be reading your feedback, that's a big wake-up call.
Yeah, great. There are so many things there that I think are worth exploring in a little bit more. One thing in particular that I think to some extent you've already said, you've laid your position out pretty clearly, but I think some teachers might benefit from a little bit more of an explicit discussion, because I know this is something I do with a lot of the teachers I work with. You talked about removing some of the noise from the scores that you do give. Now, I want to spend a lot of time here talking about removing grades altogether, but as I'm sure you probably experience, and many of the teachers I'm working with, they are perhaps sympathetic to the cause, but are in some situation or another where grades are mandated, scores are a part of their job. And one of the things that I end up working with teachers on is, okay, if you have to give scores, make sure they are what I try to refer to as pure scores, in the sense that they only grade the subject that you're teaching, the academic performance or the student's ability in that subject. And so you talked about removing some of those, what I call the noise. If a kid comes late to class, that doesn't make them any better or worse at mathematics. And so if the score, if they get a 96 on their test and then you knock 5 points off because they came late to class, that tells the world that they're 5 points less good at maths, which isn't true. Is there anything else I just want to make that very explicit, because I think that's something a lot of teachers overlook. Do you have anything else to add there? Or?
No, I mean, and I think that's part of the reason why we hit on the term going gradeless is
Right.
that there's a bit of a continuum here.
Yeah, I like that.
So gradeless, I experienced it actually. I had the benefit of experiencing this. I was clueless at the time when I experienced it, but actually at University of Michigan's residential college, we were gradeless. And we got narrative reports. That is without grades. Literally, I have no GPA from my undergraduate college. So that's one definition of gradeless. You can also say less emphasis on this sort of economy of grades, I think is maybe the other end of the continuum. And I think certainly what you describe with the pure grades and trying to get some of those other things out of it that muddy the waters is absolutely, I think moving toward that. And what I've found is going through that process, when you adopt some of those practices, it does start to open the door to some of the ones that I think are later down the road. So I really do think that you have to check in with your community. You have to check in with your school. And I am not advocating that people be totally cavalier about this, but I do want to present some of the research that's been done that says that if we can, we should look at ways that we can start moving in this direction where that formative moment in a student's education can be more purely formative. The minute you put a score on it, it's going to feel summative to them, regardless of what you say. And there are ways of mitigating that situation, certainly. Retakes, encouraging people to revise, just harping on that, saying this is not the end. Great. For students, it does feel like the end. And 24/7 online grade books have not helped matters either.
Right. Yeah. And also just being, sometimes being one teacher in opposing the rest of your faculty. unfortunately, I think comes across as quite meaningless when you tell the students, don't worry about the grades. They might go, yeah, okay, we hear you, but we're told there are 29 other teachers here telling us every day that the grades are the only thing that matter. And it's difficult for your one perspective to kind of to float to the top of a lot of opposing voices, right?
Right, that's true. Although, that was the situation that I was in for most of
Yeah,
my career. And
yeah.
I do think that the kids appreciate it. I do think that in a lot of cases, the idea of moving ahead as a whole school is
Yeah,
probably going to be even less likely.
yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and so this idea of probably being the only one, or maybe part of a smaller team, or you might look at doing, like a ninth grade bridge program, or, one of these smaller areas of the school
Hmm.
where you can pilot this approach. And
Yeah.
I think that that is a lot of times one of the best ways to bring that sort of thing in, and to build some of the infrastructure that can hopefully later be used by a larger group of teachers.
Yeah, I think that's a valuable perspective. And I've also found, not necessarily with this particular subject for a reason I'll come back to, but with other things I've
Mhm.
tried to innovate in the classroom. Again, I've often been the one teacher doing things a different way, and that often starts out by drawing some displeased looks from other members of the faculty and the seniors. But what I have found, the flip side to that, has been that often my students have carried their attitudes outside of my classroom and into other classrooms. And again, sometimes that's triggered some additional resistance from teachers that don't like being confronted with changing views in their classroom. But it's also the benefit being, it's also opened up some teachers' eyes. And by having students in my class, I've always told them, I've never encouraged them to impose anything outside of the classroom. So I've always told them, look, this is the way we do things in my classroom, but you still respect the way things are done in other classrooms. But to some extent, things are going to kind of bleed out of the boundaries of the classroom. And the most positive outcomes I've seen there have then been some of those teachers come and ask me, oh, what's going on in your class, that why is this happening, and is there something we can change? And I get some teachers then come and ask me, and you must have had that similar experience.
Right. Yeah, that's a very delicate thing. And, as I've moved into an administrative role here, and left teaching, I'm always going to consider myself an educator. Um, I understand the precarity that teachers feel, so teachers are just as much oftentimes oppressed by these same systems as
Yeah.
our students. I'm a huge fan of Thomas J. Giovanni. You mentioned Texas a little bit earlier. He used to work down in Texas, has
Okay.
since passed away, but he's kind of an educational philosopher who says, um, we need to build in canvas. This is a metaphor that he used, and apparently in World War II, the Allies had not massed their tanks yet. I think
Okay.
this was maybe in the North African theater, and they had these inflatable canvas tanks that they literally put out to the front so that when the spy plane flew over, they thought that there was a full complement of tanks ready to go, but they were not there. They were not
Wow.
ready. And I think that he points to that on a lot of opportunities of this need to kind of project, possibly a certain amount of bureaucratic competence and
Hmm.
similarity with
Yeah.
the surrounding ecosystem.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, that buys you some time to be building and to be having some conversations, and just be seeing what are the things that, I think in my case right now is what are some of the things that teachers are really struggling with,
Yeah.
because there are some real imperatives that they, I think a lot of times are responding to,
Right.
that we need to be sensitive about. I think especially during this time where I feel like the work of teachers is being more and more devalued.
Yeah.
We need to
Yeah.
be very careful about that.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there's been a really strange roller coaster in the last few months, where there was a short period where everybody really sort of recognized in a very bold way the value of teachers because of the students being at home and all the various things that have gone on over the last 6 to 12 months, depending on which part of the world you're in. And yet then that seemed to crash right back down. And attitudes have become suddenly very negative again now. So I think teachers are going through a lot at the moment. And something as well about, you mentioned the research a couple of times, various bits of research here. There are things that teachers know because of the research. They might be, reading books and listening to TED Talks and various other things. And they're getting a sense of what's best for the students. And in many cases, it opposes, diametrically what they're being told they must do by the administration. And then as a teacher, not only are you overloaded by the work that you're being told to do, but there's an extra burden when you know that what you're doing is not in the student's best interests.
Yes.
There's a psychological burden there, I think, that going into the classroom knowing that what you're about to do, because you have to, you feel you must, but that it's not the right thing for the students. There's a particular hardship, I think, there that teachers face.
You're absolutely right. And in some cases, the burden is not just psychological. It's that I'm going to build this whole thing over here, but I'm also going to maintain this thing over here. And so
which is what I spent so much of my time doing.
Yeah, I'm doing double time on things. I remember back with standards-based grading and learning, where I was maintaining my assignment-based grade book, and I was also maintaining a paper and pencil standards-based grade book. And I think that really was one of the things that pushed me to the breaking point of like, what am I doing here? Well, is this really that helpful for students?
Right.
And I was feeling the answer was just an unequivocal no. This is not helpful, even if it is standards-based learning and grading, which I think is more like that pure grade that you're talking about.
Right.
And actually at CVU, we do use standards-based grading and learning. We have a standards-based grading and learning grade book. That said, some of those negative effects are still happening in spite of the fact that we're working inside of, supposedly more of a pure grade, a grade that is more reflective of academic performance.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, again, referring to some of the research, and you talked about the impact of presenting a comment or feedback type response along with a grade of some kind or another, which is for a long time what I did, and what I would recommend to many of the teachers that I worked with. And it was actually, I already was pining to get away from the grades, but again, feeling stuck in a system, you think, okay, well, look, I'll do what I'm doing and I'll do what I have to do, and I'll do both. And then it was really Alfie Cohn in particular, and he's been on the podcast as well, was the first time I came across some of the research via his books, presented via him, saying that, if you do that, and it was immediately obvious, I'd missed it, but it was immediately obvious. If you do that, they look at the score and they ignore the rest. And it has almost no benefit. And so then what I started to do was I would, and in some cases, this is what I still do, is I'll give the feedback and I'll give them a chance to retake, and then I'll give feedback again. And only when that process, the iterative process, is done, will I then put a number on it. And I'd still rather not. And where I can, when I'm running my own courses, I don't. But when I'm working in a school or a formal situation, the sort of compromise that I've come up with is I'll hold back the grade for as long as I can. It's going to be there eventually. It's going to get recorded in some sheet or book eventually, but I'll hold that back as long as I can and try and get the feedback process to the front of the students' focus. And it seems to work, but again, there's just the existence of a score. It has some unavoidable impacts. If it's there, it's going to have some impact.
Absolutely. And I think that delayed is pretty much what all of us do. Most of us are in a situation where we have to assign a marking period grade. Many of us have found ways of finagling our situation so that we don't need to give a grade until the very end of the marking
Right.
period.
Right.
And that all the way through whatever that marking period is, we can have these rich discussions. There is an expectation or an invitation, at least, to come back and to enter into that iterative process that you mentioned is really part and parcel, I think, of our process is that we see this as a process. It is not just kind of like a product that we're after. And we feel like by kind of banishing the grade, at least to the very end of things, in a responsible way. And I think that that's one of those areas that we can't be cavalier. Students are feeling incredible amounts of anxiety right now about grades and scores and college admissions. And I need to get a scholarship or else I cannot go to college. I mean, basically. And so we can't be cavalier with that. We have to acknowledge that. At the same time, I do think that I personally feel that we do need to engage in these questions of quality. And how do we do that outside of a rubric? So one of the biggest tools that I think got developed out of the whole standards-based grading and learning movement was the rubric. And the rubric is the epitome of what I described to you, comments and feedback. And in some ways, a cheaper form of comments and feedbacks, in that it's this one size fits all type a tool that we can use, and that saved us a lot of time, obviously. I think that is one of those areas that I think a lot of us gradeless teachers have put a lot of thought into, because we do need to communicate to some of the stakeholders who have a right and a need and a want to know what's going on with kids and where are they vis-a-vis some of the targets that we see for this particular class. So that's a whole big thing. And in some ways, Alfie Cohen is one of the people who I believe said, when we start talking about the hows of assessment, it tends to drive us back into the shadows. But we need to talk about the hows. We do need to get some structures and systems. If we reject grades, we should, in the same breath, be prepared to give a replacement to that. Or at least communicate what's happening.
I think I don't think there can be nothing. And I now do more work with teachers, and I do training courses that lead to various forms of certification. And so there has to be the concept of standards, the concept of accountability, the concepts of competency are essential. And so you want to be able to focus on all of those things without all of the burden of scoring and grading. And even at the school level, when again you want to hold those off, okay, at the end of it all, there's going to be a number in a document somewhere, because that's what the system requires. The danger then is students are just worried, well, what if that day comes? The score that I haven't seen all year, that day comes, and then that score is a low score. You've got to go through this ongoing process without that fear. And the only way that it's a very intangible response, but the way that I kind of have come to think about it is, well, my job as the teacher or the trainer, my responsibility is to ensure that we get whatever that is, whether it's a score or a grade or competency, whatever that kind of final thing is. That's my job. My job is to do everything along the way. If it looks to me like you're falling behind, or you're not going to reach that level of competency that we're aiming for, then it's my job to provide the support and the guidance to get you there. And then the essential element then is the trust. The student needs to trust that I'm doing that. And so you can't do all of this in a bubble without also building very genuine relationships with the students that are based on trust and a mutual respect, so that they believe when I say, don't worry about the score, I'll worry about that. We're going to do everything we can to make as much progress as possible. I want you to learn. We're going to do all of that. And you need to trust me that when the score comes at the end, you won't be surprised by it. That doesn't always mean it won't be low. The reality is some students, there are so many other problems that we're not talking about here, like
Mhm.
students being in the wrong place at the wrong time, all of those things that we also have to deal with, that also have an impact on whatever score is coming out at the end. The thing that I have tried to focus on as a guiding principle is that whatever score, if there's a score, whatever score or grade or letter that comes out at the end of it all, at the very least, my students shouldn't be surprised by what grade. They shouldn't be expecting an A and then they get a D, or they shouldn't be expecting a 90 and then they get a 70. That if they should know what kind of trajectory they're on. We should be able to signal that without actually using the numbers.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think one of the ways, and someone might argue with me that there are some numbers sort of behind this, but I think one of the big ways that Teachers Going Gradeless have tried to do that is by being very clear about that exemplary criteria.
Yeah.
So Rubric always had
Mm-hmm.
your one kind of wow in the
Yeah.
exemplary 4 point whatever it was, that
Yeah.
description. And then rather than developing all these other descriptions that are basically not yet, you're not
Yeah.
there,
Right. Yeah.
just go with that, communicate that, and then have conversations holding that in mind. And then also sort of being willing to revise that and to be open to, um, other notions of quality, I think is one of the things that a lot of Teachers Going Gradeless open up to is that there really can be kind of a dialogue here that takes
Yeah.
place if we allow it to happen, that we
Yeah.
are not the gatekeepers of
Right.
quality, that
Right.
there are some understandings in my own particular field of writing that I'm continually being surprised by,
Sure.
like, why did that work? Why was that
Yeah.
so
Right. Yeah.
amazingly good?
Yeah.
And in allowing them to bring some of their mentors and models to that conversation as well. But
Yeah.
to a certain extent, holding on to that idea of what exemplary looks like and that conversation around what exemplary looks like.
Yeah.
And then, yes, I think as the people who are ultimately going to be certifying and conferring, whatever it is on these students, because there is an institutional responsibility there, I would argue.
Yeah.
As we go, I'm saying that there is sort of an adequate level at which a
Mm-hmm.
student can perform.
Yeah.
And I need to keep an eye on that. Now,
Yeah.
below that, where you would traditionally have your D's and your E's, you'll find, and this is one of the ways that I use my assignment-based grade book, is it's just a 0. And it's
Right. Yeah.
not a 0 like 0%.
No.
It's a 0. That part of my grade book, and again, I don't want to get too detailed here, but that part of my grade book is worth 0%. And all it means is that it was either not turned in, I have no
Mm-hmm.
evidence, or it wasn't
Mm-hmm.
adequately done,
Yeah.
and that I need more.
Yeah.
And I want to work with you, and I'm going to hang with you until you get to that point.
Yeah.
So at the end, what I have, and this is again me negotiating. This is not anything like Teachers Going Gradeless, the book. This is
Mm-hmm.
what you should
Mm-hmm.
do. But within my community, they needed to, whether it was students, parents, interventionists who would maybe be able to come in and help students, they needed to know where students stood
Right.
with regard to the material in my class. So what they would see is kind of a line of zeros and check marks, not the most
Yeah.
romantic thing in the world.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But if there were too many zeros, and in that case, a lot of times there's something other than academics going on,
Yes. Right. Yeah.
I would put an incomplete in
Sure.
the grade book. Not a
Yeah.
D, not
Yeah.
poor, not failing,
Mm-hmm.
just right now we're sort of like really incomplete.
Yeah.
And so if there is an interventionist, if there is a care team that is keeping an eye on these kids,
Mm-hmm.
I want those caring adults, even if they don't understand gradeless,
Yeah.
I want
Yeah.
those caring adults to be able to come around those students, because we've seen this in the pandemic.
Yeah.
We know that kids get lost for a variety of reasons,
Mm-hmm.
and we can't wait for everyone to be on board. we need to find ways of communicating, us gradeless teachers, I think in particular. I guess this is really on my mind just because of the moment that we're in. We need to be able to communicate using these channels as imperfect as they are.
Yeah.
And at the same time, hopefully build this wonderful opportunity for students to have, students and teachers to have great conversations without worrying about that grade all the time, without that
Yeah.
grade continually intruding on our growth mindset.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think
No.
it can be done, but it's a constant, it's this constant dialogue and it's this constant tension between the structures that are already there. And I think there are some people who just say, just burn it all down. I think burning it all down is going to hurt the most vulnerable and marginalized
Yeah.
students.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you're on something there. I think the terminology is important. You talked about incomplete there, as how you describe that sort of, the below adequate, and being in the professional industry, as it were. So doing professional training with teachers and a few other areas as well. It's quite common to use, because we're aiming for competency. You are a competent teacher. It's quite common then to use incompetent as the other side. And what we do in my institution, and I think this is growing now in use, is we use the term not yet competent. So we say, when you've completed everything, you will be competent. At the moment, you are not yet competent. But then along with that, there's a lot of description as to, okay, what are the steps between where you are now and where you need to be. And again, this is all in an attempt to be progress oriented, to emphasize the growth mindset approach, rather than you are it's a focus on what needs to happen next. What are the things that are missing that you can do, and the goal is to get you up to that point. And we believe you can, because here are the concrete steps that you can take. Here is what you've done so far. Here are the things we haven't seen evidence of yet. Sure. And again, these are all things that you can negotiate with the students. You can have the student know what the line of competency is, or in your case, what that adequate line is, and say, how do you think you're doing? Here are the features that we're looking for. Here is the evidence that we need to say you've achieved that adequacy. You tell me, have you done these things yet? Is there anything that you think you need to focus on? And 7, 8 times out of 10, you'll get a response from the student, or whatever level you're at, you'll get a response from the student, I found, that says, oh yeah, I think I could probably do more of this. And then you're in a position there where, as I say, you're progress oriented. It's all about being at a point on a journey rather than being in a fixed status. Right. So I hope that that sounds similar to I think what you
like what you're saying there. And I think one other thing that I'm hearing is that you're really eliminating one of the biggest ways of sharing that idea of competency or quality has been sort of the rubric, and in teacher training, which I've been very much involved in teacher training. Oh, that's the most hated part of the job, is these, we can have these wonderful conversations. And of course, there's probably a situation where we need to flag a teacher who is not going to make it.
Of course,
and we certainly don't want to have that person, continuing in the profession thinking that they're doing just fine when maybe they're not doing a good job by students. But what you described there a little bit is conveying what that quality looks like verbally, which is something that is not terribly hard to do, and it maybe involves a conversation. Maybe it involves a back and forth. But I also like the fact that the people that you're training hopefully are getting to the point where they can self-assess, where there's a certain amount of like, I really don't, I'm still struggling with this one thing. What I found when I was doing teacher training, mostly through Michigan State University back in Michigan before I moved to Vermont, was that teachers, and especially this new generation that has come up in a world of tests and grades, I just think that the last generation has been so hobbled by that mentality. They could enter into these conversations sort of on a day-to-day basis. But when we got to the rubric, they got so defensive. And even if we were saying this is early in your internship, they were so used to getting a 4 point
Right.
on everything. I mean, a kid who
Yeah.
goes to
Right. Right.
Michigan State University has mostly gotten A's, maybe a
Sure.
few B's.
Yeah.
They couldn't even countenance that idea that they were coming in low. And it's like, of
Yeah.
course you're going to come in low.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's that low, high, competent, incompetent.
Right.
That language is not helpful for
Right.
moving people forward. And actually, I would argue turning them into the professionals that we need.
Yeah.
Where we have high levels of
Yeah.
competence. We
Yeah.
need those high levels of
Yeah.
competence.
Yeah.
I mean, if we're talking about building a bridge and we were trying to certify whether a person's ready to do that, we wouldn't accept anything less.
Right. Exactly right.
And
Yeah.
we value our fields when we get into the situation. Okay, all right, I guess it is a 4 point. And the great inflation that almost necessarily happens
Yep.
out of
Yep.
that,
Yep.
we're going to have a lot of people who are not ready
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
what they're getting into.
Yeah.
And so, a lot of people think that this is softer and more humane, and I think it is. Yes, absolutely it is. But there are some much more rigorous conversations that can happen inside of
That's
this
right.
paradigm.
Yeah. That's
I
right.
feel like when you're in grades, you end up in this situation, especially in a high pressure world that we live in, where students are there, so much of their future hinges on these things.
Mm-hmm.
Where great inflation is just going to happen. We're compassionate
Yeah.
people. We're not
Right.
going to
Exactly right.
confine a person,
Yeah.
to a pathway that they're not going to enjoy.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so
No,
we
you're right.
find ways of doing that. We fudge things.
Yeah. You're right. And something that's just struck me, literally just as you were talking there, a meeting point of two perspectives, or two problems that
Mhm.
talking about the grade inflation, and the talk of competency, and the
Mhm.
other thing as well that you get when you're grade focused generally has been one of the other underlying problems of it all has generally been that these are very heavily knowledge reliant tests, right? So they're tests that regurgitate knowledge, and they're tests of memory
Yes.
recall, all of these
The
things that
easiest
we're
thing to
aware of
measure.
because they're so
Right.
measurable, right?
Yep.
Which is one of the reasons why when I'm doing the teacher training in particular, I can move away from the grading side because we're so focused on competency. We're so focused on applied abilities more than knowledge. It's inherently less numerically measurable. There is a more qualitative aspect to it that can't be avoided, and so you've got to spend a lot of time focusing on that, and therefore the transition away from numbers and letters is almost natural.
Yeah.
Although ironically, I mean, I've taken some courses before that have these conversations. They are there. There's a trainer in the room who's there to teach you to be a more effective teacher. So they're talking about student-centered approaches, they're talking about humanistic approaches and holistic approaches, and then at the end of it, you have to take an exam to pass the course. And you go, well, so it's no wonder that the teachers can't always implement it, even when they have some of the right ideas. But we're so trapped in a system that's so heavily reliant on scores. But there is something about grade inflation. I wonder as well, I don't know how to. I'm developing this idea as we speak. I
Yeah.
wonder as well. We see this grade inflation. We see teachers trying to help the students out. Right? They know that if the student doesn't get the grades, it's the student that's going to suffer for that. And a lot of teachers either feel guilty or just compassionate, whichever one of those is the motivating factor, and they will do something to help the student get the grades they need. But I wonder as well if something underlying that is the awareness that the scores themselves are kind of meaningless, right?
Mhm.
I think we all kind of know that, well, it's only really, the score only really tells us this. So how much am I really hurting the person if I inflate the scores? Even if I'm aware that the disconnect between the
Yep.
truth and the score, at the end of the day, we all kind of quietly agree that these scores are not very valuable anyway. So what does it really matter? But because they are knowledge based, and we do all know that. But then the thing that I'm trying to connect here is at the later stage, when it comes to hiring somebody or putting somebody into a university, the pretense is brought back in, where the scores are treated as though they do represent competency when everybody already knows they don't. There's this strange, it's like we're
Mhm.
all just kind of holding this lie up together, and every
Yeah,
one of us is just as complicit in it. I don't know, I can't, there's something there where there's two sets of hands at work here, and both of them know the truth, but for some
yes.
reason, there's a very kind of precarious system in place there.
Right. And I mean, and it's so the water that we swim in that
Yes, exactly
it's
right.
very difficult for us to imagine anything different. We can't obviously control, the admissions counselors, the people who are, looking at students' transcripts and such. I do see a lot of very kind of hopeful things. I've been working a lot with and talking a lot with the Mastery Transcript Consortium is looking at a different way of communicating
Mm,
competencies. And
hmm.
and I think there are some promising ideas about, okay, yes, these people are crunched for time. They're not going to be able to look at, I mean, that's one of the things about numbers is it's just very convenient, is that you can
Right.
just throw it into the
Yeah.
algorithm and it pops
Yeah.
out a number and you can just look at that
Yeah.
and you can easily compare people.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, that has not really been a great proxy for how people are going to succeed or not
Mhm.
succeed at
Yes.
that
Right.
next level or the world of
Right.
work or whatever it is. Um, and I do think the Mastery Transcript Consortium has a design that is really promising. And I think that's ultimately what that's kind of the final frontier of going
Okay.
gradeless is what are these outward facing things that we can have
Yeah.
that will make what we have been doing in the classroom make sense to these people who are kind of time crunched
Mm.
and want to see if a person is a good fit. And that's probably a
Yes.
better
Right. Right.
question
Yeah.
than it is how do they compare to one another, because it's like,
Right. Exactly.
I mean, it's kind of like it all gets exchanged for money almost. It's this interchangeable thing, grades are, which really don't convey much of what was the value
That's
behind
right.
that
Yeah.
grade.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah.
And I think one of the points that you made about measurable things really bubbling to the top and becoming the most important thing inside these economies of grades. I mean, they've really eviscerated so many of our subject areas. I
Yeah.
see
Yeah.
that
Right.
in language arts. Language arts is headed down this road. There are other subject areas like math that are already
Yeah.
there.
That's so entrenched in it. Yeah.
It's too, and the problem is, and I don't know if anyone necessarily saw this, you look at things like Summit Academies, Chan
Hmm.
Zuckerberg initiative, and if you look at some of these schools, these charters, they don't have math teachers. They have math coaches.
Yeah.
You
Right.
get on Khan Academy, and then this coach just sort of goes around and helps people on their math if
Right. Okay.
necessary. That's what happens when you allow your subject area to be devalued to
Hmm.
that point where it can be measured,
Yeah.
is eventually a computer is going to take over for
Yeah.
you,
Yeah. That's right.
because the
Yeah. Yeah.
computer can do that.
Yeah.
Um, Computer can do those sort of algorithmic things. And, I actually looked up this quote as you were talking from Mathematician's Lament.
Hmm.
Um, you see this in the arts, and actually right now I'm overseeing the arts, and it's like arts cannot be colonized by tests. I mean,
Right.
I
Right.
say
Right.
that now and I'll probably be proved wrong at some point,
Right.
but the thing with mathematicians is mathematicians lament. Paul Lockhart says the first thing to understand is that mathematics is an art.
Yeah. I like that.
Very
Yeah.
few, very few people have any sense of what Lockhart means when he says there is nothing as dreamy and poetic, nothing as radical, subversive, and psychedelic as mathematics. Is that our experience of what math was like?
No, I'm glad you bring maths up, because maths has been the subject that I've struggled with most, both as a student, but now also as I work with teachers. I've I began my teaching background is in language, teaching language. And so just a quick point on that as well, that I think connects with what you were saying about the value of knowing whether somebody's a good fit rather than knowing what number they attaches to them. An example that I always used, because it fits so well with my background in language teaching, was, if I've got two graduates from an English course or from an English test or whatever, and one of them has, say they get 75 on the test and the other one gets 85 on the test, then obviously that 85 is going to lift that student up and they're going to have more employment opportunities. But if I'm hiring for a call center, let's just say, and I need somebody who's good at English to come and man the phones, obviously I'm going to go for that 85. It's higher than the 75. But what I don't know is that the 15% that she missed out on was the how to have polite conversations on the phone. Whereas the other kid who got a lower grade has actually got the competencies I'm looking for, doesn't have the overall higher score, but actually has the things I need. And the score doesn't tell me any of that. And so this idea of being a good fit, obviously the scores tell us nothing of that. And also, I think something mildly ironic, perhaps, we talked earlier about the value or the importance of getting the noise out of the scores and focusing on the pure score. So if you've got an 85, that tells me only about your ability at English or history or maths or whatever, and nothing else. Right. What's great about moving away from the grades altogether is that when you focus on feedback, value-based and competency-based feedback, then you can bring those things back in because they're part of a broader conversation. So you can have part of a conversation that talks about competency in the area, and you can also comment on other things about the student's attitude and things like that. And they don't, one doesn't impact the other. There's this conversation here and this conversation here, and they're not being cross-referenced to a score that's undermined, one by the other. And that's the other thing that I found. You can just have a much broader conversation when you are having a conversation at all, rather than boiling it down to the numbers. But on maths, you go ahead first. Respond to that if you.
I think what you're expressing is, again, that this can't be a binary, at least in the present. Exactly right, yeah. That you and I got to college and beyond, by through tests. I mean, and there was a certain amount of that was just that was how we got there. And I think we do have an obligation to help a kid navigate that system. If that is the system that is in place, we have a responsibility to help them navigate that system. One of the things that I think is kind of a promising idea that balances that binary is that Joe Bowler has put a lot of work into this, and her focus is math also at Stanford University. A cohort of mathematics students who kind of had this gradeless, feedback-focused environment performed significantly higher than their peers, right? Who were part of this like frequent, targeted, graded tests, learning to solve the problems that are on the exam. It's this need also, if you are preparing for some big, huge tests, to be, this counterintuitive sense that you want to be in an environment that is going to allow you to grow and is going to motivate you to get to where you need to be.
Yeah,
and
I
so
think
that's
motivate.
The irony is by trying to almost mimic that test environment in your classroom environment, you do students a disservice. You don't even deliver on what you say you're delivering on.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think the motivate is the more important part there, because allowing, teachers might say, of course I allow innovation, I let my students. But the problem when the focus is on scores is the students aren't interested in asking those questions and exploring, because they're so blinkered by the fact that there's a score coming at the end of it. That what we've seen, and again, this was Alfie Kohn that highlighted this for me, is what we actually see, and the research shows very strongly that students work less and explore less when there's a score. You know, the assumption is the score is a motivating factor, extrinsic though it may be. At least it's a
Right.
motivating factor. But what we find is no, what it does is it says, you know, I've got the score I'm looking for, and that's enough. And then when there's no score, there's no boundary, there's no enough. The kids just keep studying and keep going. And you know, you said before about maths compared to the arts, as it were. And I found, yeah, with maths, it feels almost like a lost cause already, because when the maths teachers are the teachers that I work with, I have the hardest time working with maths teachers, partly because my background in maths makes it difficult for me. My struggles in maths make it difficult for me to really demonstrate what I'm talking about, because I can't give good examples. Where when I'm working with a language teacher, for example, you know, I've got so many language examples to give that I can give much stronger models. When I'm working with maths teachers, I have a hard time because I'm not very good at maths myself. And then on top of that, you know, maths as a field at the school level, not theoretical mathematicians at the research level. Obviously, you know, they would tell a completely different story, like the starry-eyed psychedelic quote that you just, you know, offered. But
Right.
at the school level, maths as a field is completely resigned to the fact that, you know, maths is this abstract, you know, textbook practice. It's binary. And trying to get all of the principles that I've established so well in language, and then after that in other subjects, maths has been the hardest for me to say, look, let's find out how we can make this engaging, how we can make this applied, how we can make this less abstract and more relatable. And the response that I get from most teachers is, okay, let's talk about that. The response that I get from maths teachers more than any other is, no, maths doesn't work that way. And I just, you know, I have to work so hard to say it does. You know, anything that we deem valuable, anything that we deem worthy of spending time on, obviously has a purpose. We wouldn't
Right.
do it otherwise. And so it's trying to find that purpose beyond passing the test. But it's maths is the one extreme, where the arts is the other extreme. You know, it's easy to
Right.
have this conversation with the arts.
Sure.
Maths, the hardest I've found.
Buy him a copy of Mathematical Mindsets by Joe
And
Bowler.
yeah, I'm glad to have that reference, because that
You
might
know,
be
and I
the
think
way.
the other thing, the other thing with math is, and when I was in math, and as I was trying to make some changes, teaching high school math, was I think one inroad is to see if you can get it narrowed down to the power standards. Um, because one of the other things with math is that, and when I kind of came into the math department where I was teaching, was we just had this enormous long list of standards that we had to get through. We had to
Okay.
go cover to cover.
Right.
Uh, and we lived in a northern state, so God forbid there were too many snow days, because we were in trouble
Yeah, never going to make it.
yeah, we weren't going to make it. And so what I ended up asking for, and I kind of fed this through my principal at the time, who was kind of my co-conspirator, was let's narrow that down to the power standards, to the
Right.
standards
Okay.
that are absolutely necessary. And then we have all of them. If you want to, you can go to cover if you want to. But you know what that allows for is that you can knock these you know, these standards out, and then we can also have more investigative type experiences where we can get into what does a mathematician do, what is an
Right.
applied mathematician, what are some of
Right.
the ways that mathematics are applied
Yeah.
real world
Yeah.
situations, and you can begin to get a sense of what these rich experiences in math would be,
Yeah.
because you're not so beholden to that long list of standards, which is pretty much in every standards document and is totally unnecessary. I mean,
Right.
Singapore math is one of the big, I think, textbooks that, you know, it was this thin, and it was
Right. Okay.
revolutionary.
Well,
It was
uh,
revolutionary to see that we could have a mathematics book that
yeah.
thin
Yeah.
as opposed to this big, because you don't need that. You need to learn deeply. You don't want to be an inch deep and a mile wide.
Right. Yeah.
That's
Exactly right.
not going
Yeah.
to help anyone. So I
Yeah.
do think that there are some inroads even with math, but I agree with you that it is disheartening how
Yeah.
far it's gone.
Yeah, it seems to be just off on an island by itself in a lot of ways. You mentioned applied in the world. That one of again, my point of embarkation, if you like, was from language, and it being such an applied subject. It was so easy to focus on that I really wanted to bring that into other subjects with other teachers I work with. And the one thing that I've had some success in maths with, a teacher recently that I was observing a lesson, and I'll be as vague as possible here because otherwise I'll completely butcher the whole. I'll get it all wrong. But he was teaching logarithms, and it was way over my head. But these uh, year 11, grade 11 students were far smarter than I was they got it. They knew what they were doing. But there was some struggles, obviously. It was a high level lesson for them, and there was also such a clear lack of engagement. And I asked the teacher afterwards, maybe here's where we can find, where I can try to get across my point. I said, something like that, which it was just presented as, here are some formulas on the board, here are some exercises in the book, practice them, remember them. And I said, is there anybody? There's got to be. Not is there, there has to be. There is somebody. Who is the person that uses this in their job, right? What's the, and it took him a while, he had to think about it. He said, okay, well, people on an oil rig need to use this it was to do with the rotation of the drill, to prevent an oil spill, basically. I said, isn't that so exciting? Like, isn't the idea of being on an oil drill, making sure that you prevent an explosion, isn't that so interesting? Isn't that fascinating to paint that picture, to maybe introduce the topic of logarithms, if I'm right that it was logarithms, to introduce the topic of logarithms through the story of a man trying to stop an explosion on an oil rig, rather than just some formula on the whiteboard. And something like maths is embedded into so many professions and industries. Not that I know how to do it, but satellites in outer space, that's fascinating. And how much maths is involved in that, and yet how much time does the average student in school spend thinking about those things? So it's there to be done, but somebody's got to draw those connections. The teacher has to spend an extra 5 minutes when they're planning their lessons to think, okay, now what is the connection to the real world? What's the application for this? And I think every subject, that can be done. But sometimes it seems like a slightly longer walk to get from the textbook to the application.
Absolutely. And I mean, it's funny how far we've progressed from, just the concept of going gradeless. But I do think that,
Yeah,
going gradeless sometimes is that first step
I
of
think so. Yeah,
saying, okay, we've focused so much on measurable things to the exclusion of all these meaningful things. I
right,
mean,
exactly
that
right.
is incredibly
Yeah,
meaningful. And I think would definitely captivate students. And yet, because we are really have become so servile, I think, to these measurable imperatives,
yeah,
we've forgotten about a lot of that.
right,
And
exactly right.
honestly, as you move down this road, I think, of going gradeless, I do think that you naturally begin to rediscover those disciplines. And the sad thing is that they're disciplines that we love,
Right,
that
exactly
we
right.
got
Yeah,
into them because we
yeah,
love them. Because, honestly, a lot of times, probably our most recent memory of them was at the college level, and the sort of rich, interconnected experiences that we were having. Not all the time, actually. College is in many ways colonized by the same impulse,
oh yeah, absolutely.
but
Yeah,
but we did get up into some of those wonderful, rich, interconnected experiences.
yeah,
And to be able to share, what is it that a historian does? What is it
right,
that a
exactly right.
mathematician
Yeah,
does?
yeah,
What is it that a writer does? How does a writer kind of identify quality?
mm-hmm.
Is it being able to do this formula, this
Right,
5-paragraph essay, or
right.
some other formulaic method of writing? I don't
Yeah,
think so. I don't
mm-hmm.
think a 5-paragraph essay would work with any audience, quite
No,
frankly.
no, no.
And so you enter into these conversations that are at the core of our disciplines.
Yeah,
And I feel like there's there's this excitement almost in rediscovering some of what
Yeah.
those things are, because they're there. I mean,
Yeah.
history, I think, is another one of these areas
Yes,
where it's
you're right.
like, gosh, what have we done?
Yeah.
Because we have so many knowledge-based things that we're testing kids on, and that inevitably infects the experience of learning history. Whereas
That's right.
history is this incredible dialogue, really polylogue of voices and people trying to understand
Yeah.
things from so many different perspectives.
Yeah.
And yet it's just become this sort of litany of names and dates and
Yeah.
places
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
battles.
And again, it's a perfect example. It suffers in many of the ways that maths does, because it feels, in the way that maths is often presented as being very abstract.
Mhm.
History is often presented as being, in the past. It's done and dusted, and it's that sense of, well, it's all gone. What's the point? That really draws the interest out of it, because I mean, anybody who's really engaged with history at either a professional or an academic level knows that the real interest in history, yeah, it's interesting, sure, but the real value in history is how it connects to the present day, and to the potentials, and what we can learn from the past, is so often ignored in when history is taught, because it is about, at the end of it all, sitting a test and seeing what dates you can remember, rather than what you've really learned on a core sort of human level. And again, it suffers in many of the same ways as maths does. I think it's just been completely disconnected from any sense of application. And I think that the grades, it's scores that drives this, because of the test looming at the end. That
Mhm.
does sort of wash back into the approach, well, let's just focus on getting these answers prepared for the test. Don't worry so much about the core understanding, the depth of understanding, because that's not going to be tested. And when we remove the scores, not only does it relax the burden that a lot of students face, the anxiety. I mean, we see students getting sick around exam time. It has massive psychological strain on the students, all of the negatives in those very kind of really worrying ways. But also, once that's removed, there's so much more room for these more meaningful things to come back in, because as long as we're focused on the tests and it's hard to measure these things, they get brushed out. As soon as we remove the tests, we also then allow for more time spent on these things that can't be measured but actually mean so much more. And the students then go from, or I would hope, maybe we'll see them go from worrying about this test, and if you're not telling me the score, then I'm just going to be worried about the score that's going to come eventually, to being so engrossed in the subject that they forget about the score, because the subject's so interesting. It's like, well, this is fascinating, I am learning something here, I'm enjoying this. The score, don't worry so much about it. It's the students, hopefully, that will be less worried, because they care about what they're learning. And at the moment, I don't think caring about what you learn is a priority in the system.
No, it's not, and we really have a long way to go to, I think, get back to some of those central values of those subject areas. That I think about. Yeah, you were hearing a lot of college professors talking about how kids can't write
Right.
anymore,
Right.
and this crisis of kids not being able to write. I place that at the doorstep of this whole
Yeah.
grading and testing
Yeah, I agree.
environment that students have experienced. When you look at so many of the political crises that we're experiencing, and honestly, people not able to think deeply about things,
Yeah. Yeah,
not
absolutely.
able to really think deeply about situations that are incredibly complex. That's a crisis. That
Absolutely. Yeah.
is an
Yeah.
urgent problem. And I don't want to make too big of a connection to my own shtick of going gradeless, but I do think that there is a connection. I
I
think
think
that
so. Yeah.
when this sort of need to find things that are measurable which so oftentimes are the things that are least meaningful,
Yeah.
we really don't do justice to things that are in really desperate need of attention right now.
Yeah, I think so. And to maybe do some of the work for you there, if you don't want to sound like you're pushing too hard to draw the connection. I mean, it seems to me as well that, the higher performers in the grade economy are likely to be the ones that get the better opportunities, that move into the leadership positions. But because they've excelled in the the measured area, chances are they're the ones with less of that depth of understanding, or the meaningful learning. Chances are somebody who didn't get very good grades, didn't really, the school system just didn't work out for him or her, but he really felt the learning on a much more human level, a less measurable level. Maybe didn't score so well, but understands the human value of the learning more, is never going to get to be in the position where his understanding or her competencies are going to be most valuable. Meanwhile, the highest scoring students may well have missed out on a lot of the value that we would want to see implemented at that level when they get there.
Right. They've gotten really good at thinking very broadly and shallowly about a lot of things. That's a terrifying thought. Yeah.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the other student that you mentioned a lot of times checked out.
Yes,
Checked
you're
out
right.
at some
Yeah, so
point.
true. So true.
It takes a great strength of character, I think, to put up with so much of the discouragement that a student like
Yeah.
that would experience,
Yeah.
and still hold on to that idea. But I think deeply, I think complexly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Unfortunately, we lose a lot of those
No, I think
students
you're very
before
right
they
there.
can
Yeah,
be in
that's
a
very sad.
position to really benefit us.
Yeah, absolutely. So as we come to a near to an end here, are there any what are the most concrete points you can offer to somebody who is maybe very new to this? Maybe this is the first time they've heard of this idea, or the most the lengthiest discussion of this idea they've heard, and they're in a school, they're in a situation where they've been focused on scores, focused on grading, they've been teaching to the test, and they may just be opening their eyes. What are the first kind of concrete steps that you can maybe suggest that somebody might think about taking in their classroom?
Honestly, again, I want to make the disclaimer that, the hows can sometimes drive us back into
Sure,
the
that's fair.
shadows.
Yeah, that's fair.
I think one of the things, and again, going on with that disclaimer, but Lissavoy says that part of the deep structure of the accountability movement is this need for standardization.
Sure.
So in
Yeah.
some ways, I would actually say, join us at Teachers Going Gradeless, participate
Yeah.
in our Twitter chats, listen to our podcasts, and hear the different ways
Good.
that people are coming at this issue of going gradeless. Certainly notice in your own anecdotal experience how many of these things are true in
Yeah.
your setting.
Yeah.
So I think that's the starting
No,
point,
I like
is
that a lot. Yeah.
first of all, allow yourself to be creative.
Yeah.
Maybe at some point we're going to write a book, but there is no handbook. And the
Yeah.
very fact that we need a standardized handbook is that,
Yeah.
it
No,
is
I
that
I
very
appreciate that irony. Yeah.
underlying structure of the
Yeah.
standardized
Yeah.
approach to things, so
Yeah.
that's one aspect that I would say. That said, I do think that a first step is to get to those power standards, get to those, central understandings that
Yeah.
you think you want to hold on to, that you
Yeah.
really feel that in your professional opinion, and we value your professional opinion, are very important for students to understand. You want to engage them in this, and you're going to be open kind of dialogically into what does quality mean within that. You're going to, this is going to be a learning process for you as well. But let's narrow that down. So many of these
Yeah.
standard
Good.
documents are so incredibly long. Let's
Yeah.
narrow that down to what we really want to be able to kind of certify for our part.
Yeah.
I
Good.
think what that does, when you sort of narrow and make your demands a little bit more modest, is it does open the door to that dialogic experience, that intersubjective experience, where we
Hmm.
are both sort of able to bring things to this table.
Yeah. Right.
and we can engage in this question of quality.
Yeah. Good.
So I think that that's one big thing, is to get
Yeah.
some of those long lists of standards out of the way. I think the next step, as you mentioned, is to get that grade as pure as possible. You know, really do look at some of the grading reformers, Rick Wormley, Ken O'Connor, Tom Schimmer, these Gusky, these people who are really explaining to us why we shouldn't be putting behavior related things into a grade, where we really want that grade to mean something to the greatest degree possible.
Yeah.
I think the next part is just as we start thinking about formative versus summative,
Yeah.
looking at the research of how putting that score or that mark or that grade on something really shuts down the growth mindset.
Yeah.
And can I delay? Can I keep that out of the conversation for as long as possible so that I can engage in these wonderful conversations with students, and that I can zero in on things that they really are committed to?
Yeah.
Can I find other ways of communicating quality with students other than a rubric? Can I
Yeah.
expose them to mentor text, to exemplars? You know, so I think that's it. As you build that out a little bit, I think what you'll find with a lot of gradeless teachers is they want to have some sort of portfolio.
Yeah.
Many of us
Right.
have
Good.
decided that we want to have some sort of portfolio,
Hmm.
where we can kind of link some of what we're doing, the artifacts of what we're doing, to standards, so that I can kind of present that.
Yeah.
And then I think always, as we were talking about early on, is that we need to be aware of the communities that we serve. And we can't be cavalier about this. We do need to be in dialogue with those
Yeah.
larger
Yeah.
communities,
Right.
with the school community, with the communities we serve. And we need to develop things that are going to be intelligible to them. And I really think you can get them on this bandwagon. I think they're
Yeah.
gonna love a lot of the wonderful feedback that they're getting.
Yeah.
Um, but at the same time, you need to be able to build in Canvas.
Sure. Yeah.
And
I think that's
to
a
keep
nice
that in
reference.
mind, have civility with the people that you serve,
Yeah.
and realize that this is a process.
Yeah. No, I think there's some great things there. I think your last point is particularly strong because the gradeless approach is inherently more communicative. And
Mhm.
so, you know, what you're putting out there is communicative, is descriptive in a way that you know, you think should be able to get people on board, because you're actually saying something meaningful to them in a way that, you know, the existing model just is not communicating anything meaningful really. So hopefully that just by being more dialogic in the whole approach, you know, it's creating a voice that can be listened to in a much more concrete way, I think.
You would hope so. And
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think that one of the things that we're talking about in schools is really amounts to a crisis of meaninglessness,
Yeah. Yeah.
nihilism.
Yeah. I think so too.
When you put out that sort of humane and human-centered kind of thing, people grab onto it because it's
Yeah.
like it's a relief to be to not be objectified,
Hmm.
to be
Hmm.
invited into this relationship, which is at the core of what we do as teachers and learners.
Yeah, that's right. And then the other thing I very briefly want to just touch back on the first thing you said, because I think it's really important, you know, perhaps not being burdened by standards in our approach to, or in our attempts to move away from standards, I think is really valuable. And something that
Yeah.
I often have to approach cautiously, but I do feel, and in fact, I'm going to have somebody very soon. We'll be talking more about research and data and evidence-based approaches. But so there's an element of caution, but I feel quite strongly that the anecdotal experience of teachers is valuable. And I think that something like this, the gradeless movement as well, is an area where a lot of teachers, I think, already have a sense of what they would care about more, and they already have observed things in the classroom, but they're burdened by the grades that they have to give. And I think you're probably right that if teachers just spend a little bit, you know, just spend a moment looking inward, okay, well, what do I care about, and what do I want to spend my time on with the students? I think they'll come up with some, obviously, as I said, there's some caution here. We have to think very critically about what we're going to try in the classroom. But I think that there's probably some strategies teachers will come up on there that they kind of already have, maybe bouncing around in their minds. They just haven't had the opportunity to experiment yet.
Right.
So I think there's, I think I like that first point. You've offered some very concrete options, but I like that idea. I think that's a very important kind of foundation to build on. Thanks very much. Where can people get more involved? Where can people find you and get engaged with the community? And where should we send people?
Well, I think the best place is teachersgoinggradeless.com, and that is really populated mostly by the reflections and the ideas and the structures and the systems that many different gradeless teachers have come up with within their own particular setting. It's just a rich resource, and we are so glad to have had so many different teachers from around the world kind of build that out in a lot of different ways, and realizing that there are a lot of different ways of getting at this, I think. So that would be one place. We do have Twitter chats, and I think that has been kind of a central part of what we've done, because we do like to have people coming together and just coming at this from a lot of different angles. We do that second and fourth Sunday of each month, and actually we just had one last night that was really great, valuing student language. So participating in that, we have a Facebook page, another place that you may prefer to go there, longer answers, and also searchable. So if you want to go to any of these platforms and search for your level, search for your discipline, you can find lots of great resources that you can use. So I think that would be a great starting point.
Brilliant. I'll put links to all of those in the video description. So if anybody's watching this on YouTube, you'll find that all down underneath. And it's been a real pleasure talking to you, Arthur. It's really helped me cement some of the ideas that I'd loosely been developing in my classroom. And so I hope it's had the same. Effect on some of the people watching as well. And if you have enjoyed it, please remember to like and subscribe. And thanks very much, Arthur. Hope to be in touch with you again very soon.
Hey, thank you very much. It was a great conversation.